When they found me out inside the building, I was on fire.
P.J. Allen was just 18 months old when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building. 168 people died, including 19 children. P.J. suffered burns over more than half of his...
On the morning of April 19, 1995, the heartland of America was rocked by an act of calculated domestic terror. At precisely 9:02 a.m., a Ryder rental truck loaded with 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer mixed with diesel fuel exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. In a single instant, 168 people were killed, among them 19 children inside a second-floor daycare, and more than 650 others were injured. Glass, concrete, and steel sheared away like paper, while the blast cratered the earth, shattering not just buildings, but the illusion of national security on American soil. For a nation largely preoccupied with the looming specter of foreign threats, particularly in the wake of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, suspicion initially turned to Middle Eastern terrorist networks. But within hours, the evidence began to point inward. The face of America's deadliest terrorist wasn't an outsider, it was one of its own. Timothy James McVeigh, a 26-year-old blue-eyed Gulf War veteran from Pendleton, New York, was arrested less than 90 minutes after the bombing for a mundane traffic violation, driving without a license plate. The arresting officer discovered a concealed handgun under his windbreaker. In his car, an envelope containing quotations from the Turner Diaries, a white supremacist anti-government dystopian novel, hinted at the ideological fury that had driven him to mass murder. 2 days later, McVeigh was publicly named as the primary suspect, with federal authorities quickly linking him to Terry Nichols, a fellow Army veteran and co-conspirator, and to Michael Fortier, another acquaintance from his Army days. The trio's motives traced back through a tangle of armed patriot militias, radical gun rights absolutism, anti-government paranoia, and conspiracy theories. This was not random madness, but premeditated political violence. For McVeigh, the bombing was vengeance, retribution for what he viewed as government tyranny. He cited the 1992 standoff at Ruby Ridge, where an FBI sniper shot and killed Vicki Weaver while she held her infant child, and the 1993 siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, where a fire claimed the lives of 76 people after a weeks-long standoff with federal agents. April 19th, the date of his attack, marked both the second anniversary of Waco's end and the anniversary of the 1775 battles of Lexington and Concord, the opening salvo of the American Revolutionary War. To McVeigh, it was a day for rebellion. There was no list of names, no dossier of personal grudges or vendettas. Timothy McVeigh wasn't hunting individual enemies. He was striking at a symbol. The people inside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995, weren't strangers to him because of distance or anonymity. They were strangers by design. McVeigh believed their deaths were necessary, collateral, tools in a message meant for the federal government and anyone who might one day stand in its service. McVeigh didn't care who was in that building. When questioned later about the 19 children who died in the blast, infants and toddlers from the America's Kids Daycare Center on the building's second floor, McVeigh didn't flinch. "I knew they were there," he told his biographers Lou Michel and Dan Herbeck, "but I considered them collateral damage. I'm sorry, but that's the price you pay when you attack a government building." In the days leading up to the bombing, McVeigh and his accomplice, Terry Nichols, assembled the bomb at Geary Lake State Park in Kansas. It was a crude but effective mixture: ammonium nitrate fertilizer, nitromethane fuel, and Tovex explosive boosters, packed into barrels loaded into the back of a rented Ryder truck. 2 fuses, 1 backup in case the first failed. A simple kitchen timer connected to a blasting cap completed the circuit. McVeigh had calculated the bomb's yield down to the pound. The blast would level the north face of the building, devastate the surrounding area, and crucially, be captured by security cameras and news crews. The people inside didn't matter. What mattered was the statement. The moment of detonation. At 8:57 a.m., McVeigh parked the truck directly beneath the building's daycare center and in front of offices for the Social Security Administration, Secret Service, and Drug Enforcement Agency. He stepped out, locked the cab, and walked away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. The north face of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was peeled away in an instant. A fireball rose into the Oklahoma sky, leaving a crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Glass from more than 300 nearby buildings shattered in a shockwave that registered as far as 30 miles away. People on the street were thrown to the ground. The blast wave blew children out of their cribs. Floors collapsed onto each other. Office workers were impaled by flying debris or crushed beneath the rubble. Police, firefighters, and emergency medical teams scrambled toward a scene that few had imagined outside of war. Smoke hung in the air, thick with concrete dust and burned flesh. Survivors clawed through the wreckage, calling out for colleagues, friends, or children. A nurse named Rebecca Anderson rushed in to help the wounded. She was struck in the head by falling debris. Her death would make her one of the day's many unsung casualties. The suffering on the street. Among the dead was Chase Smith, a 3-year-old boy decapitated by the blast. The coroner's report would later note his death as instantaneous. There was Bailey Allman, whose lifeless body was captured in a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph being cradled by a firefighter. She had turned 1 year old the day before. Hundreds more were injured. Burns, lacerations, fractures, traumatic brain injuries. Some would lose limbs. Others would spend years unable to walk into office buildings without trembling. The killer's escape. Even as the city bled, McVeigh was already on the road, driving north in his yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis. His plan was to disappear into the heartland. He'd shaved his head, packed his belongings, and left Nichols behind. He carried a loaded Glock 45 under his jacket. But less than 90 minutes after the bombing, fate intervened. Oklahoma Highway Patrol Trooper Charlie Hanger noticed the Marquis had no license plate. He pulled McVeigh over near Perry, Oklahoma. Calm, expressionless, McVeigh handed over a falsified driver's license under the name Robert Kling. When Hanger asked if he had any weapons, McVeigh admitted to the pistol tucked beneath his windbreaker. The trooper arrested him on the spot, not for the bombing, but for carrying a concealed weapon. As rescue workers dug through rubble back in Oklahoma City, the man responsible for the carnage sat silently in a jail cell, booked on a minor gun charge, his role in the attack as yet unknown. Pain in the hours that followed. At the crime scene, the scale of suffering defied language. Emergency workers pulled 95 bodies from the wreckage within the first day. In some cases, they found entire families obliterated. The sound of beeping pagers buried with the dead echoed through the debris as family members desperately tried to reach loved ones they didn't yet know were gone. Survivors, their faces caked in gray dust, wandered in shock. Parents screamed for children. Blood pooled on sidewalks. A chain-link fence erected to secure the site quickly became a memorial. Flowers, handwritten notes, teddy bears, and photographs attached by those left behind. McVeigh's cold calculation. When interviewed months later, McVeigh expressed no personal pain, no regret, no anguish for the wounded children, or for the firefighter who carried a dead infant from the rubble. "I had to send a message," he told his defense team. For McVeigh, pain was political. Death was transactional. He believed he was fighting a war against tyranny, and in that war, innocents could die. By the time Timothy McVeigh entered the federal courtroom in Denver, Colorado, in April 1997, 2 years had passed since the Oklahoma City bombing. America had changed. The chain-link fence that once guarded the ruins of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was now adorned with thousands of mementos. The names of the dead had been carved into stone, and the image of a firefighter carrying the lifeless body of a 1-year-old girl had seared itself into the national psyche. But to McVeigh, this wasn't a trial. It was a stage. He wasn't there to beg for his life. or apologize to the families of the 168 victims. He believed he was a soldier in a war against government tyranny. His mission hadn't failed, only stalled. A courtroom calculated for distance. The trial was moved to Denver to escape the intense emotions of Oklahoma, but distance couldn't blunt the weight of what had happened. In that courtroom sat mothers who had lost their children, widowers, and survivors with prosthetic limbs. Even the defense knew their clients' odds were vanishingly small. McVeigh entered each day in an orange jumpsuit, or, on occasion, a suit and tie. He sat with a peculiar calm, his face an unreadable mask. Reporters noted his demeanor as chillingly ordinary, a man so bland it was difficult to imagine him orchestrating mass murder. McVeigh's narrative, from terrorist to patriot. From the beginning, McVeigh's defense wasn't centered on denial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. A receipt for ammonium nitrate fertilizer in his handwriting, eyewitnesses who placed him at the Ryder truck rental, and parts of the destroyed truck's axle recovered from the blast site, serial numbers intact, tracing directly to the vehicle he'd rented under a fake name. Instead, McVeigh attempted to frame his actions as a desperate, necessary act of rebellion. He cast himself as a martyr in waiting, a man driven to violence by a corrupt federal government that trampled the Constitution, murdered its citizens at Ruby Ridge and Waco, and would, he insisted, do so again. He referenced the Turner Diaries and cited the Founding Fathers, claiming his bomb was the shot heard round the world. In private conversations with his legal team, McVeigh insisted that the American people would one day view him not as a murderer, but as a freedom fighter. The prosecution's case, methodical and merciless. Lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler was unflinching. Methodically, he presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and survivors' accounts to demolish the veneer of political protest McVeigh tried to wear. Hartzler laid out how McVeigh had chosen a building with a daycare center, how he'd calculated the blast radius, and how he'd parked the truck at precisely the spot that would inflict the highest body count. The prosecution showed jurors images of what remained of the 19 children: tiny burned shoes, a pacifier, charred toys. Witnesses sobbed on the stand as they recalled pulling bodies from the rubble. In the gallery, McVeigh rarely reacted. No visible regret. No flinch at the images of the dead. If anything, he appeared faintly bored. The martyr's words. McVeigh's own words, from letters, interviews, and conversations recorded in jail, were damning. He spoke of the bombing as a military action. He referred to the dead as acceptable casualties. In one chilling letter to a friend, he wrote, "I'm sorry, but when government becomes tyrannical, killing innocents is inevitable. They die in every war." The defense couldn't mount an insanity plea. McVeigh was too lucid, too calculating, nor did they claim innocence. Instead, they suggested Terry Nichols bore more responsibility, an effort the jury saw through. The verdict and McVeigh's last stand. After 23 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all 11 counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and the murder of federal law enforcement officers. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, McVeigh declined to speak. There was no apology, no final plea for mercy. His silence was strategic, designed to maintain the image of the stoic warrior, unbowed by the state's judgment. Later, in a letter to his biographers, he described himself as a prisoner of war, the failed attempt at martyrdom. But McVeigh miscalculated. The public didn't see a hero. They saw a mass murderer. Survivors spoke to the media of their grief, not government oppression. The myth McVeigh tried to build crumbled in the daylight. Even in death row interviews, his attempts at moral justification faltered under basic human questions. Why target a daycare? Why allow for random death? Why kill men, women, and infants who had no power over policy? His answers were circular, evasive. It was war, he'd say, but no one else agreed they were on a battlefield. The execution and final statement. On June 11, 2001, McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 33 years old. In his final statement, he chose not to speak. Instead, he left behind a handwritten copy of William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. But even in death, McVeigh's desired legacy, as a rebel martyr against government tyranny, failed to materialize. The Oklahoma City National Memorial remains standing, 168 empty chairs, each etched with a name. It speaks louder than McVeigh ever did. His supposed martyrdom was buried in dust and silence. The moment the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was reduced to rubble, law enforcement faced the most devastating terrorist attack on U.S. soil up to that point. 168 dead, hundreds injured. No warning, no claim of responsibility. Within minutes, the FBI's Oklahoma City field office, led by Special Agent John Hersley, realized this wasn't a gas leak or industrial accident. It was a bomb, a massive one. And somewhere, the person who built it was walking free. Clues in the ashes, the bomb scene. FBI special agents, ATF bomb techs, and local police began working the cratered site immediately. Shards of glass, chunks of concrete, twisted steel, and buried beneath it, forensic gold. At ground zero of the blast, a piece of twisted metal was found, the rear axle of a truck. The axles of heavy vehicles often survive explosions, and crucially, they're typically stamped with serial numbers. Investigators quickly secured the fragment and located the number. Within hours, agents traced it to a specific vehicle, a Ryder rental truck. Now they just had to figure out who rented it. The Ryder truck had been rented from Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas, a small town 300 miles from Oklahoma City. The rental paperwork showed it had been picked up under the name Robert D. Kling, an alias. The shop's employee, Eldon Elliott, and his assistant, Tom Kessinger, remembered the customer. A clean-cut, military-looking young white man, about 6 feet tall, 180 pounds. Kessinger, an amateur sketch artist, even produced a composite drawing. This was John Doe number 1. And, chillingly, Kessinger said the man had arrived with a second person, John Doe number 2. But this second figure would remain a mystery. While chasing the truck rental, agents canvassed local motels near Junction City. At the Dreamland Motel, a woman named Leah McGowan told investigators a man matching the composite sketch had checked in on April 14th, 5 days before the bombing, paying cash and giving no ID. In room 25, agents found traces of ammonium nitrate residue in the bathroom and evidence of a recent bleach cleanup. The man had checked out on the morning of April 18th, the day before the bombing. McGowan remembered his car too, a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis with no license plate. What no one in the federal manhunt knew yet, the bomber was already in custody. At 10:20 a.m. on April 19th, barely an hour after the explosion, Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger had pulled over a yellow Mercury Marquis on Interstate 35 near Perry, Oklahoma, about 80 miles north of Oklahoma City. The reason? It had no license plate. The driver was calm, polite, and carried a concealed loaded Glock pistol under his windbreaker, illegal under Oklahoma law. Hanger arrested him on the spot and booked him into the Noble County Jail as a routine weapons charge under the name Timothy McVeigh. At the time, Hanger had no idea his prisoner was the most wanted man in America. Back at the Dreamland Motel, agents found a business card left behind in the room's trash can. Scribbled on the back was a cryptic note, TNT at $5 a stick, call after 7 p.m. This was enough to cross-reference motel records, And that's when the FBI realized McVeigh's arrest file from the Noble County Jail had a mugshot that matched the composite sketch of John Doe number 1. Suddenly, they weren't looking for a Middle Eastern terror cell, as initial speculation had guessed. They were hunting a homegrown, white, Gulf War veteran named Timothy James McVeigh. 2 years after the blast, McVeigh was hauled into a packed federal courtroom under suffocating security. SWAT outside, snipers on the rooftops, metal detectors humming. Inside, the man who murdered 168 people for a cause only he believed in sat in a stiff suit, unblinking, as if this was all a minor inconvenience. The government had built a wall of evidence: bomb components, receipts, motel logs, phone records, the yellow Mercury Marquis, and witnesses from Ryder truck rentals to motel owners to the Dreamland motel manager. But McVeigh wasn't going to apologize. He wanted the world to hear him roar. The plan: turn the trial into a platform. From the start, McVeigh and his legal team, led by Stephen Jones, a defense attorney who knew he was defending the indefensible, planned to argue not innocence, but justification. McVeigh wanted to spin himself into a martyr, a soldier forced to strike against a tyrannical government. To the horror of survivors and victims' families, he planned to defend the bombing as a legitimate act of war. His opening statement would frame Waco, Ruby Ridge, and the 1994 assault weapons ban as unprovoked attacks on liberty. The Murrah building bombing, in his mind, was righteous retaliation. Jones tried to rein him in, pleading, "If you turn this into a political theater, they'll kill you twice over." But McVeigh wouldn't budge. He wanted to read from the Turner Diaries in court. The testimony: body parts, blood, and evidence. The prosecution called survivor after survivor: a mother who crawled through rubble with her dead toddler in her arms, a firefighter who found a severed baby's leg in the wreckage, an FBI agent who described pulling body parts from the daycare center. Every hour, the courtroom filled with the scent of sweat, tears, and righteous fury. McVeigh never flinched, never cried, never even apologized. When forensic techs displayed twisted metal fragments from the bomb's rear axle, traced directly to his rental truck, he leaned back in his chair, impassive. When McVeigh took the stand, against every sane legal strategy, he smiled faintly. He explained the choice of April 19th with cold detachment. Waco, Lexington. It had to mean something. He quoted the Founding Fathers. He invoked the Second Amendment. He spoke of government overreach, Waco's burned bodies, and how every action has a consequence. When asked about the 19 children, he called them collateral damage. The gallery gasped. One victim's father lunged toward McVeigh before marshals held him down. In that instant, even the most hardened court staff knew. No insanity plea, no war hero past, no government provocation could save this man. 23 hours to seal his fate. After 5 weeks of agony, the jury deliberated 23 hours. 11 counts: murder, conspiracy, use of a weapon of mass destruction. Guilty, on all of it. McVeigh sat stone-faced as the verdict was read. Outside, Oklahoma City survivors held up photos of lost children. The next morning, jurors recommended the death penalty. His final gambit: Invictus and no regrets. On June 11, 2001, at USP Terre Haute, Indiana, McVeigh faced death by lethal injection. He refused a last meal beyond 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, refused to make a public statement, but handed the warden a handwritten copy of William Ernest Henley's Invictus. Its final lines: "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Even in his final moments, McVeigh clung to the myth he built: a lone warrior standing against a monstrous state. At 7:14 a.m., the lethal cocktail surged through his veins. By 7:21 a.m., he was dead. Outside the prison, a crowd of survivors cheered.